Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Felicity Hassan. I am the Managing Director for Ordelis and Involve in New York. I'm currently based out of my home in Westchester, so welcome to my closet of learning. We are two businesses which are dedicated to leveling the playing field for diverse talent. So Ordelis is an executive search firm which specifically focuses on that mission. So we do that through a number of different methods, but really kind of focused on trying to make sure that we have a diverse pipeline of talent going into our clients. And then what Involve does is it really helps our clients to actually help retain them by developing a culture of inclusion within their organizations. So this course today that we're going to run through in record time in 30 minutes is redacted from a 2-hour course that we ordinarily provide for our clients. And we actually created off the back of some of the partnerships we have with some nonprofits who are targeted towards diversity and some of our clients who are really looking to be more thoughtful about injecting more diversity into their recruitment process. Because we're moving at pace, we probably won't have time for Q&A at the end of this session. So please, as we go, feel free to add your questions into the Q&A box. You'll find that in your banner, either at the top or the bottom of your screen. Makeda will point that out to you now, and she's going to be on hand. So if you have any issues with sound quality or connection, then Makeda will ensure that she is addressing that. Adriana, I know that you've raised your hand. So Makeda, why don't you hop in and just point out where the Q&A box is and any other tech.
Cool. Hello, everybody. I'm Makeda. I'm the digital executive at Involve. So a quick technical run through. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. So if you have any questions that come up during this session, just pop that in that box and we'll follow up in an email. Secondly, you'll see that there's a chat box. So in this chat box, you can make any comments, any nice comments about the session or any resources that you wish to share. Please throw that in the chat box and we're happy to follow up with that as well. If you need to leave the session just a tad bit early, don't worry, we are recording the session, so you'll get a copy as well. So thank you, and over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Makeda. So anyone who's raising their hand, I noticed a couple of people were raising their hand. If you're having challenges or you can't hear or anything, please pop a note in the chat box and Makeda will address that. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so as an overview for this, I really want to stress that HR and recruiting structures internally are complex. This is a course which is specifically focused on trying to offer some solutions and some best practices for both recruiters and for hiring managers. So I wanted to kind of make sure that this is kind of received as advice which can be leveraged as a bolt-on or in addition to practices that you already have. If your HR department or if your leadership team decides that they want to make a broader investment into recruiting and inclusion within your organization, that is completely down to them. But everything that we're talking about today can be incorporated as just kind of an addition to what you're already doing. So today we are going to be covering a variety of things, again, from the perspective of both the recruiter and the hiring manager. We're going to be looking at best practice for recruiters. We're going to be looking at principles and core values within your organization, which are critical to talent strategy. We're going to be talking about implementing behavioral-based interviewing questions. We will talk about interview best practice, and we will talk about candidate preparation. So, starting off, best practice for recruiters. So, in the first instance, we highly recommend that you build trust and mitigate bias. So building trust as a recruiter, you really need to know your customer. So dedicate some time to understanding the business that you're supporting. If you're supporting a tech business or a product business or a procurement business, whatever the business happens to be, take the time to really understand what it is that they're doing, how it is that they operate, challenges that they may have within their team, succession planning that they may be looking at. Partner with both the business head and also with your HR business partners to really understand what the strategic objectives are for that group. What that will enable you to do is gain credibility with your hiring manager, and credibility gains trust. And with trust, you can have much more of a working relationship, which will enable you to influence some of the recruiting decisions that are being made, which is so important during this process. So knowing your customer is an absolute cornerstone of what we're trying to do here. Identifying bias is also going to be absolutely critical. And that's something that you can do from the outset of any assignment that you're provided. So whether or not you're thinking about a job which is open, or whether or not you're looking around corners and seeing what opportunities might be coming up down the line, you can start to identify some biases that come up. And as you get to know your hiring manager, this is an opportunity for you to identify, do they have a preference for the school that they went to? Do they have a preference towards a particular geography, a particular company? And can you start addressing that by really just kind of helping to guide them through a more open-minded approach to the recruiting process? So that's really it. Identify some biases that might come up. And as I say, bias, I think, is associated with a much more macro concern around, bigger issues that we might have, out and out racism or misogyny. It's not really that. It often really comes down to whether or not you would prefer to hire somebody from Boston College because that's where you went. So really kind of think about that. Be thoughtful and expand. This is the second point, and really critical to making sure that you get things right. So when you're being thoughtful and expanding the role that you're working on, what you want to do is think about removing biased language from job descriptions. There is a bunch of technology that you can leverage to do this. Textio is a fabulous tool that really kind of focuses on gender balance within job descriptions. But if you have employee resource groups within your organization, or if you have colleagues that you can speak to, bring a little consensus into the process. Let a couple of people read the job description and see how it reads. It's really important for you to kind of get a sense of whether or not, if you're talking about best athlete or you're talking about a rock star, that's going to gear slightly more towards men. You really need to think about, whether or not you have a job description which is really focused on the best candidate for the job. Developing a brief that attracts the broadest range of candidates is what you're looking for. So this is also a case of what is essential for this role versus what is preferable. I remember a situation while I was working in-house where I had a client who had always asked for project management experience. And ultimately, when we dug down, that wasn't prerequisite for the role. When we asked whether or not they wanted a PMP qualification, they weren't entirely sure what a PMP qualification was. It was just something that had been on the job description forever and hadn't been taken off, which had probably prevented them from hiring a great candidate. So really important to be thoughtful about what is nice to have, what is absolutely essential. Third point, innovate and actively engage. So this, I think, is the most critical part. And I'm going to come back to this point over and over again during the course of these 30 minutes, which is you have to change your inputs if you want different outputs. So if you have historically not procured a diverse range of candidates for a search, that won't change just because you've decided that you want diverse candidates for that search. You have to be proactive in the way in which you engage a different audience. So you have to commit to a range of passive and active sourcing. So passive is really what I would refer to when I think about posting the role and waiting for applications to come through. On average, I would say in my experience and in terms of previous employers, about 5% of those applicants are applicable. And that's probably not a completely diverse crew that are coming through from that either. So you really have to engage your network, think about referrals, reach out to your community, reach out to other individuals within your organization. Again, lean on your employee resource groups if you have them, and think about different partnerships that you can have. There are a number of nonprofits out there who would love to have access to the opportunities that you're working on. Organizations like ELC that support Black and African American executives, organizations like Alumni Society and Alpha, Elite Meet on the veterans side, Catalyst for women. These organizations are actually motivated to really help driving their community forward. So reach out to them. They'll be interested in helping you and supporting you by delivering candidates of difference. And then finally, craft process. Ensure that your process is clear and that the interview loop is diverse. Now, ultimately, you may not necessarily have a diverse loop according to like the traditional concepts of that. But make sure that you incorporate people into the loop who have a vested interest in the success of this candidate, because that's going to be absolutely critical for their longevity within your organization. So, principles and core values. When it comes to principles and core values, most organizations have these. So what you need to do is you need to identify the core values and principles around which your organization is built. This is going to be really important in the context of building intentional culture. And what intentional culture does for your organization is it avoids you falling into a toxic culture, which is very easy to do if you don't have a very kind of clear guidepost as to what you want your culture to look like. So if you think about some examples, Google's top principle is focus on the user and all else will follow. Or American Express, who have a principle of good citizenship, being great citizens in all the communities where they live and work. Most organizations, as I say, will have 5 to 10 core values or principles that you can align with. So make sure that you're aligning these principles to competencies, and then those competencies in turn with behaviors that you can assess against in the recruitment process. So for example, if agility is one of your principles, your competency is probably going to be the ability to adapt. So a behavioral-based question in that context would be, maybe talk me through a time when your team or your company was going through a process of change. How did that impact you and how did you adapt? When it comes to behavioral-based questions, this was a process that we were implementing over at Bloomberg while I was there, and was very established over at Amazon while I worked in that organization. It's a process which has really kind of taken hold within the tech sector and has definitely become a very kind of prolific practice. You don't have to build your own behavioral-based question bank. Because this has become a very common form of questioning, I would say build or borrow. Behavioral-based questions really enable interviewers to seek tangible examples, and that's really what you're looking for. You're looking for tangible examples of when a candidate has performed tasks that you know you're going to need in this role. Ensure your principles-based approach draws on both technical and cultural abilities. And the best way to do that is to divide areas out so that you can collectively touch on all the competencies that you're looking for without duplicating effort. Again, I'll come back to that process as well. A couple of raised hands. So please make sure that you pop any comments in the chat box or the Q&A box. We'll come back to it if it's Q&A. And if it's chat around sound quality or connectivity, then Makeda will be on the case and will help you out. So finally, arrange a pre-brief. Secure your hiring manager and interviewer buy-in and commitment to the philosophy, goals, and execution of the new structure. As I say, this is a bolt-on, so this can be incorporated into a process that you already have. But when you ask interviewers to incorporate behavioral-based questions, there will be a sense of nervousness around whether or not they'll be able to execute against that. So it's really important to talk it through and make sure that everyone is prepared for this process. You're also, to the extent that you're now kind of committing yourself to a more diverse audience, you're also going to be hiring candidates that maybe come from a slightly different background. Really important that everyone understands like what it is that you're looking to get out of each specific hire, so that they know exactly what it is that they're assessing for and that you're all on the same page about what the end goal is. So a little bit more about the behavioral-based interview process. So the behavioral-based interview process, the reason why this has statistically become much more relied upon in the current interviewing philosophy is that what it's asking you to do is to procure practical examples of when somebody has performed a task, which is much more indicative of their future ability to perform that task. And that's really what you're looking for in terms of like optimizing your chance of hiring the right person for the job. So when you ask that question, the answer that you're going to get is going to be aligned with the STAR method. And the STAR method, just go through it a little bit. Situation, task, action, and result. So when you're asking a behavioral-based question, which is largely tell me about a time when you performed this task, your candidate is probably going to talk about the situation. They're going to describe the situation that they're in. They're going to talk about the task. What was the task that they performed in that situation? What was their action? And what were the results? And as you can imagine, that kind of yields a much more kind of meaningful response to a situation rather than giving a hypothetical or talking through their resume, which again, may be something that you're asking them to do in addition, but having this behavioral-based process is a really kind of critical piece in the puzzle. So the ideal process is something that we adhere to. Again, this is a guide and not a doctrine. So by all means, there are kind of adjustments that can be made to this, but this is a process that we really believe is something which can be really effective for you. So first of all, you start with your pre-brief. As discussed, that gets everybody on board and makes sure that you have assigned your competencies and your behavioral-based questions, that all of the interviewers understand what their commitment is to the process in terms of preparing ahead of time, in terms of going in with an open mind, and in terms of the feedback commitments that you're going to request from them. Really important that you get a strong feedback form in a quick turnaround from individuals. I would then go to the hiring manager interview. If this is a critical hire for your organization, and I would say any hire is going to be critical in the current climate, we are definitely not going to have oodles of excess headcount. So think about the importance of this hire, and make sure that your hiring manager interview is an opportunity for you to really assess whether or not this candidate is broadly going to be right for the team and the structure. If not, then you probably don't want to pull in the rest of your interview team to kind of invest their time in meeting with that candidate. Because the next stage is the stakeholder interviews. So you're probably going to have a team of around 5 individuals from various different backgrounds, people that this individual is going to interact with on an ongoing basis. That's going to be on site to the extent that we get on site in the future, or indeed via Zoom. If you're doing it via Zoom and scheduling kind of dictates that that you want to do it over a period of time, I would say just try and make those stakeholder interviews within a 48-hour period. And then you have a debrief with all of your interviewers, and that's when they provide their feedback ahead of that debrief. You want them to have provided all of the pros and cons of what they saw in that candidate based on the competency that they specifically assessed against, and then a conclusion from their perspective as to whether or not they would progress this candidate based on that particular competency. And then you want to go through the offer and reject process, and I'll go through timelines shortly. So best practices for this process. Interviews should be with no more than 2 people at a time. Those of you who've worked with me in the past will know that this is something which I'm very passionate about. Panel interviews don't get the best out of candidates. They're a very intimidating process. So really important that we're trying to set up our candidates for success. We really want to make sure that we get the best out of people, and this is not an intimidating process. So ideally, interviews should be with no more than 2 people at a time. If you are bringing somebody on site, and as I say, that will come a time when we can be on site again, and you're bringing them in for half a day to meet with 5 people, then it's not essential, but refreshments and breaks are a really nice thing to have. Your hospitality will be recognized and appreciated. And if you're a little nervous, sometimes a little water and some snacks can go a long way. Think carefully about your interviewer group and ensure you have a direct line manager, those that they'll need to collaborate with, as well as HR and recruitment representation, ideally. Again, I'll think in the context of diversity, if you have a diverse group of people as it relates to race, gender, orientation, and so on and so forth, that's fantastic. It's not necessarily prerequisite in the process. If you're hiring this individual because you know that you need more diversity, my personal perspective would be just to be candid about that process and just making sure that that person feels confident about the environment that they're coming into. Interviews should ideally be no more than a week apart. If scheduling extends, then just let the candidate know. Most people are pretty understanding about that process, but you just need to be transparent. I think transparency is the key here. And hiring decisions should ideally be made within 24 hours of a debrief. So an offer or rejection should be conveyed within a week of the stakeholder interview, ideally. So, interviewing best practice. Critical points here: be consistent, be human, be open-minded. So when we talk about being consistent, what we're really thinking about here is following the same process for all candidates. Now, this can be a tricky one. If you end up having a referral come into the process, or you have an internal candidate for your opportunity, sometimes it feels clunky to put them through the same kind of structured interview process that you're putting other candidates through. It's absolutely critical that you do that, principally so that everyone is being assessed on a level playing field. Your internal candidates will thank you for going through that process, because at the point at which they secure the role, they will know that they've done so on their own merit, and not because they had preferential treatment through the process. So really important that you're very thorough in that assessment. So in terms of being consistent, in accordance with our advice, we would suggest make sure that you stick to that pre-brief. Doesn't have to be in person, as I say, to the point that we get back into the office, doesn't necessarily have to be in person, but you do need to have a pre-brief. Get everyone together on a Zoom call, go through the role description, go through some of the candidates, go through some of your objections of what you want to get out of this hire, you know, how they're going to fit into your strategic goals and imperatives, just so that everyone understands exactly what your motivation is as a hiring manager. Really kind of go through the behavioral-based interviewing process. Really highly recommend dividing out competencies among the interviewers so that your interviews are not duplicative. And commit people to feedback. The feedback is so important. There's very little point in you being part of an interview process if you can't consistently provide feedback. So again, my preferred format would be they should come back to you with the pros and the cons aligned with the competency that they specifically were given to assess against, as well as any other kind of anecdotal comments or thoughts that they have on the candidate, and some kind of vote either way in terms of like how they would like to move this candidate forward. And then all of those feedback notes will be aggregated for the debrief, and you'll go through your debrief process. The debrief ideally should have somebody who's a little bit more objective to the process, just to ensure it doesn't get derailed. Sometimes if you have somebody who's particularly outspoken or more senior in the room and they kind of express their opinion, the rest of the feedback can get thrown a little bit off center because everyone wants to align with the person, with that individual. Try and make sure that there's somebody in the room who can help really kind of pull you back to the actual feedback that was provided, so that you can have a much more balanced conversation in that debrief. Being human. Be present. Acknowledge the commitment of the candidate. Take an active interest in their story. Think about ways in which to present yourself. Ultimately, this is a nerve-wracking process and people really have kind of dedicated time to coming in. It's really important that you're present. Examples that I've seen is people turning up late to interviews and perhaps not apologizing, maybe turning up having not been effectively briefed for a role and making that clear, like, I'm sorry, could you just tell me why we're meeting again? You know, things like that are really demoralizing for a candidate who's kind of given up their time in order to kind of come in, and for whom this is really important. We spend an awful lot of our time at work. So really important to make sure that there's an equal investment on both sides of the equation when we're talking about this process. De-escalate stress. Endeavor to make a personal connection initially, beyond just your initial kind of, hey, isn't the weather great, and all of that kind of good stuff. Maybe try and like break the ice by telling a little bit about yourself and then flipping it over to them. Give them the opportunity to catch their breath before you kind of really sort of move into the hardcore interview process. And be gracious. When someone handles a question and they feel very hesitant about it, or they seem to be going off on a tangent, which is not what you were looking for, rephrase the question in a way that'll get the answer that you're looking for. You know, that's going to be beneficial for them and for you. Just remember that sometimes this is nerve-wracking. You've got a lot of adrenaline involved. Be open-minded. So remind yourself to be conscious of any information that you got ahead of time. Again, a lot of people will want to share their perspective on a candidate or their perspective on a candidate's background. Don't let that taint the way that you are assessing that candidate. Really important for you to be thinking in a neutral way as you go into the meeting, so that you can come out with a fresh perspective. That's why you're part of this process. Send your candidate a preparation guide ahead of time to ensure that they're offered all the same opportunity to be successful. We'll come back to that in a minute. Ensure you have a strong understanding of the role requirements and do not over or underplay what is needed to be able to do the job well. Really have a think about what's essential and what can be taught. Ahead of the interview, identify what different experiences would present a unique value add to your team or your business. Now, ultimately, if you have a group which is all women or all men is a very kind of easy example, or everyone kind of came from a similar kind of academic background, perhaps you want to look at a slightly different perspective. Perhaps you have consistently looked at Ivy League and you really want to kind of bring in some individuals from more of a state school background. Maybe you have consistently looked at some of the top consultancies and you actually want to think about ones that are slightly more smaller and innovative. Really think about this in a little bit more deeply to kind of think about how you can expand the diversity of your team and subsequently the innovation that you can come up with. So candidate preparation guides. This is really critical. I think when it comes to candidate preparation, not all candidates will intuitively know what you're looking for. So the feedback that I've got for candidate preparation is often, hey, how a candidate prepares for my interview is really how I assess who rises to the top and who's the best and who's the most committed to this opportunity. I totally get it and I completely understand, but that is working on the assumption that that all candidates know exactly what it is that you're looking for. And candidates who come from a similar background to you are likely to present a little bit more the way that you would probably be looking for. So just be aware of that, because that's kind of somewhat of a bias in itself. So I would advise them to think about your company. See where your company has been in the news recently. You've just gone through like a major M&A transaction. They should probably know about that. Think about the people. Who's in your leadership team? Who are they meeting with? What are their backgrounds? Those are going to be really important elements in the interview process to really kind of help build rapport. So ask them to prepare for that. And then also to think about the competitive landscape. It would be useful for them to have an understanding of the market that you're in as well. In addition to that, they should be thinking about their resume. They should know the thread that runs through their resume and any kind of particular stories that illustrate their experience. They should have an understanding about what your principles are. They know that questions that are coming to them are going to come off the back of that. So make sure that they have an understanding of your principles and point them in the right direction so that they know where they can find those. And then their story. They need to make sure that they're able to kind of articulate their story and why they're motivated to come and work for you. So an example tips for candidates, that's something that we often think about is when we're preparing candidates for interviews, identify a couple of examples that illustrate the core elements that are required for this role and think about how you can present them in response to a behavioral-based questions. Be prepared to call out successes, but more importantly, because these are things which don't often come to the top of your mind, be conscious of failures and how you can call out things where you haven't been successful or you haven't achieved a goal, and really kind of how you picked yourself up from that process, because your self-awareness is definitely going to be critical in any interview process. And when you're thinking about that self-awareness, try to couple it with experiential examples and ideally a bit of data if you can. Ensure you know the dress code ahead of time. Again, slightly less applicable on Zoom, but certainly useful if you're going to present in person. And prepare questions ahead of time. Intellectual curiosity will set you apart from your peers, so really important to think about questions ahead of time. So in summary, train and support your recruitment team, please. They are your front line to the market, so really important that they're presenting the best of you. Create a value or principle framework that underpins your culture and all hiring activity. Establish a structured interview process and stick to it. Incorporate behavioral-based interview questions. Acknowledge interview best practice and ensure all your interviewers are adhering to it. Prepare all of your candidates so that everyone is competing on a level playing field. And I would say really kind of make sure that you are being thoughtful about this inclusive recruitment process. So without further ado, thank you for attending today. If there's anything that we can do to support you in your critical hiring at the senior level, then do please let us know. And obviously, if you've got any questions about best practice, we'll address anything that came into the Q&A box, but really keen to help wherever we can. So please don't hesitate to reach out. My email address should have been in the chat function as well. So always happy to take questions. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.